Let's just start out with a general concept of how you see your organization fitting into the ecosystem of youth sports, and particularly quality youth sports. Start with you, Beth.
So as Tom mentioned, I work with the Dick's Sporting Goods Foundation and also with Dick's Sporting Goods. So we have the philanthropic grant making side through our foundation, and then we have the retail side where we are very active in our communities. So we're interacting with young athletes kind of at the exciting moment when they're either registering for their new season or they're coming in to shop for the equipment. So part of our mission is to inspire and enable sports participation. So where we are in the ecosystem is sort of neutral because we're kind of brand agnostic, and what we want to do is motivate participation in any sport with the whole collection of brands that we offer in our stores. So I'd say we're most emphasizing is quality participation and access to sport for all kids.
Terrific. Caitlin, let's jump over to you, and we'll come back to Dave because we're a little strategic about this.
Sure. I was listening to Beth and thinking, well, we're a bit brand agnostic too from where we sit in global community impact. Our whole focus is on really believing that sport has the power to move the world, but we can only unleash that potential in kids if they believe themselves that they're athletes. And we know that all kids were made to play. If you've ever seen a group of kids, it's really hard for them to sit still. But how that actually translates into them having the ability, confidence, and desire to move for life, that's the challenge that we collectively have in front of us. And I think that's an all brands pre-competitive issue.
Great. Laura?
Yes, so coming from the healthcare world, Hospital for Special Surgery has been known for treating professional athletes. Many teams, many of which I'm sure you know. But we have a history of working with kids in the community as well. And our focus is trying to prevent those injuries. We don't want to treat them when they have an injury. We want to really think about what have we learned from professional athletes and how can we apply that to children in the community. And we have a program that we are focusing on parents and children as well as coaches that you'll hear more about as time goes on. But it's really taking those lessons and making sure that kids are healthy physically and emotionally and want to play sports.
Great. Gary?
Back in 2014, NBC, or I should say prior to 2014, my answer to this question would be by providing great coverage of sports events and inspiring America's youth with great storytelling. And we continue to do that. But when we acquired the Olympics through 2032, which was back in 2014, we reflected a bit on how important it was for us, selfishly, that the United States continued to succeed at the Olympic Games. And we began to look at, what's the level of participation in Olympic sports, and quickly realized that in some cases it wasn't great. Met Tom along the way in that exploration and got a better sense of the issues. And then ultimately began to explore how we could play a role and looked at some of the companies out there that were involved in helping create access, managing teams, leagues, providing parents tools to bring their kids together with sports programs. Ultimately acquired a company called Sports Engine, which you've heard of and we've talked about today on a couple of different panels. And it is, a great software solution, a great company that's committed to opening up the doors for parents in the United States to access sports programs across the country. Right now, that is a very big focus of NBC Sports.
Definitely. Now, Dave, you're in a little bit. You are the one person on this.
Onto these things is not the same.
These are all national organizations. You are not. You have a regional focus. But tell us how you see yourself plugging into, the telling of a story that, is at a national level valuable.
So Mr. Wilson owned the Buffalo Bills. For those of you who don't know him, passed away in 2014. And the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation is his estate that was put forward to benefit Southeast Michigan and Western New York. So we're geographically locked in 16 counties. But I think the impact will be national, Tom, with the work we're able to do in those spaces. So start with analysis. We didn't see clean analysis of sports and recreation in either market. So we did the sports scans that were in Buffalo, Rochester, and in Southeast Michigan, very specific on what was the ecosystem, how do we define it, what are its strengths and weaknesses. And I think our role will continue to be that kind of higher level, what is an ecosystem, what's a coalition of the willing, who do we fund to fill gaps, how do we create coordinated outputs, all through our grant making and through key partners.
Well, you also have the opportunity to pilot projects, right? I mean, test out some of these ideas at a local level.
It's a privileged position to be in. Yeah, but we want to affect change. So, and we have a board that's willing to take risk. So we're willing to pilot projects that will get kids more active, more engaged in sports and recreation. You know, there's only really two caveats to the work we'll be doing. One, it's got to have an impact on young people, and two, it's got to eventually be sustainable. How do we sustain this beyond what will be the remaining lifespan of the foundation, which has to spend out of existence by January 8th of 2035.
Yep. So let me ask you, so what is the, and maybe Caitlin, this is for you, what is the, we're throwing a lot of numbers out there today. What's the one that you think this group ought to be thinking about most, and how to move that number?
Yeah, it's a big issue. When we talk internally about how do we measure success, one of the things we really just start talking about is how do we move the unmoving. And when you look at the numbers that are out there, some of it gets muddied by is it multi-sport? Is that the same kid who showed up to play in the community basketball league that also showed up to play community baseball and played soccer? And part of what we look at when we invest in program partners is how do you not just get the first 100 kids who show up to participate, but how do you identify ways to get those kids who wouldn't normally come, whether they're girls, whether they're in communities that are generally underserved, whether they're kids who don't currently have a great coach, but the kids who aren't moving, how do we get them to move? So I would sort of say if there's a number we try to move the needle on, it's that, because kids who move will move the needle.
Beth, any thought on that?
So I agree with what Caitlin said. I think the other number we think about quite a bit is the growing disparity of access. And I think the statistics that you published today show that we're becoming, in terms of youth sports, a group of haves and have-nots. And so our foundation is particularly focused on funding in communities where there isn't as much access to quality sports education and to public school sports programs, because we think that that's a pretty easy way to get access to all kids is through school sport.
I mean, Dave, you work in Detroit, a city that has a distinct have and have not economic scenario there. You've been involved in a number of other initiatives, non-sport related, that have tried to address that gap. Any ideas, any guidance, any advice as this group moves forward?
Sure, it's simple. No, it's some of the most complicated work to do, because it's not just a matter of access from a standpoint of facilities, it's an access in terms of culture. You've created cultural divides that are racial, that are by income levels, and so attacking them require multiple attack points. They require community engagement at levels we have not yet experienced the way we need to. We've got to think differently about how we want to ask kids to do what they want. We need to think about how we're doing that and how we're educating parents on the results we're getting back, and we have to listen to the data and what they're saying. So it's one thing to ask, another thing to listen. And we don't do that very well in our urban centers, and frankly, we don't do it very well in our rural areas as well. And these disparities make it more difficult.
Any guidance on how to, given your experience with collective impact, how to create alignment among key stakeholders on a given initiative? I mean, for instance, you did good work on the New Economy Initiative in Detroit.
Sure. I mean, the New Economy Initiative was an economic development initiative. It started as a $100 million fund that 12 foundations participated in, and we recapitalized for another 35 or 40 million. And the first 96 million produced 2.9 billion in economic impact. 3 lessons from that. 1, start with assets. We tend to start with deficits. Start with assets. These kids are assets. If we ask them what I want, and then we listen to them, and then we look at the alignment of existing programs, we can start to make simple adjustments very quickly. Two, someone has to wake up every day thinking about this. You've really got to have that backbone organization or a local coordinating body, somebody who gets up and says, what are we going to do about this gap or this hole? And I think the third piece is storytelling. Ultimately, you have to change these cultural issues. And you can only do that through telling stories, which I think folks on this panel are doing a great job at, but we've got to get that down to a local level. How are we telling the stories of success and kids that are having success because of their participation and activity levels?
I mean, Gary, you're in the storytelling business. I mean, where do you see an NBC Sports plugging into supporting the storytelling piece, or maybe even the technology piece, connecting kids with the full array of experiences? Can we close some of the gaps through those assets?
I wish the answer were a clear yes, because not only does NBC do a great job, so many other organizations, media companies, and there's so many great stories to tell, and there are more and more pathways to tell those stories, and more outlets for people to view them. But it's probably not quite accomplishing the goal. If you had asked me, Tom, the prior question, participation for us is what matters most, and I think maybe an ingredient that hasn't truly been addressed is motivation. And yes, there are the haves and have-nots, and so it's sometimes unfair to criticize or just to evaluate or question motivation. But what is it? When I was a kid, and so many of us have reflected today on our own experiences, and I'm glad Jeremy, who I know is a lot younger than I am, seems to have had a similar experience. So it isn't that long ago that play was what we strove for. That's what we sought. That's what our parents denied us when we did something wrong. Okay, you can't go outside today, and yet now we're all in this room and spending a lot of time on trying to figure out how to get kids to do that. And you and I, Tom, have from time to time, or you've probably humored me, but from time to time talked about what are the incentives that we can impose on the system to inspire kids to play beyond great stories. And I don't know what the answer is to that.
Yeah, Laura?
I agree with what everyone's saying. I think we have to think about the stories we're telling. And traditionally, the stories were about winning the gold medal, breaking records. And I think what we learned from our experience working in communities, that's important, but it's not important to all kids and their families. So I think we have to think about what are the stories to be able to engage those kids in the type of programs that are going to get them off the couch, get them active, get them doing sports that maybe is not winning the gold medal, but getting them out there. We heard it in some of the stories today from the kids. So I think we have to take a step back and say, what has worked traditionally maybe when we were all going into sports? Today, what do we need to listen to and then enact on that?
And so who are the audiences that most need to consume those stories? Is it mayors to make it a higher priority on their list? Is it parents? Is it school administrators who are defunding school sports? I mean, who are the audiences?
I think it's all audiences. I think that if we're going to be change agents and get kids active, kids from different communities, the haves, the have-nots, we keep using those words, I think that those stories have to be told on many levels. I think for people who are looking at policy, and we talked a lot about mandating, coaching, training, it has to be the people who set policy that need to understand why it's important, perhaps, for coaches to have training that's common to all, whether you're a volunteer coach or a paid coach. So I think it has to be different stories that reach different people so that we raise the bar and make change happen across all those different audiences.
Dave, when we talk about incentives, I mean, this is what grant making is, right? It is money if you do something else. I mean, how do you see your $1 billion that you need to get rid of, not all on youth sports, I know, over the next 17 years as being a catalyst to, change the story, at least in the regions where you're working?
Oh, well, it's, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as incentive, but you're right, it is incentive when you look at it from the standpoint of how do you get groups to take operating support by agreeing to certain metrics and outcomes and participating in certain ways. That's traditional grant making. I think there's an overlay of storytelling on this that is essential if we're going to have success. Because ultimately, we've got to change a parental culture. One that says it's okay if my kid doesn't play travel ball. My kid should be in more than one sport. And what we have seen, it's been a bit of a surprise. It's been really gratifying to see the reports that Aspen did with the community foundations get taken up by the local media and then reused. So there was the outflow. But in Rochester, they did the spring sports edition. You know that one in the local paper where they show all the kids that are all the best athletes in the region, right? In Rochester, they said, you think that multiple sports sampling thing isn't important? Look at these kids. And every one of those kids played multiple sports. Every one of those kids had higher GPAs. They picked it up and started telling the story for us. So in some respects, I think it's getting the data out in a way that's accessible to the media and others to tell the story, and building a campaign around that, which in 16 counties, we can certainly focus in that way.
I mean, Laura, you're the research chief at HSS. I mean, what role do you see data and research playing in changing the ballgame?
I think it's pivotal. I mean, especially if we're talking about changing policy. If you look at the public health issue of just osteoarthritis, kids that get have ACL repair, 50% will go on to have osteoarthritis, and that's a huge burden on society. So collecting that data and being able to say that market, which is the public health people, you have to have data. You have to have clinical data to show that if you, one of the programs we're doing, which is HSS Sports Safety, is we're creating very specific tailored prevention programs to prevent ACL injury based on age and type of sport. You have to have that data to be able to say, look, we did this and we found that this makes a difference. So I think it's very valuable. I don't think we can speak from experience, but we also have to speak from what we know works and doesn't work.
So what kind of data is and this is a question for you, Caitlin, because you think in sort of a marketing type of way, but Beth, maybe you can jump in here as well. What type of data is most useful? That which points out the problem, or that which points out the opportunity in terms of rallying people toward progress?
I think that, first of all, this thing we talk about internally, that this is the least active generation in history, and we should never get comfortable with that. And so in some ways, it sort of depends where you are in the conversation. If people don't know there's a fire, they're not going to send a fireman. On the other hand, people also have to feel like they're empowered to put the fire out themselves. And that's where I was thinking about, well, which audience and what are we doing? I think at this moment in time, part of what you have to do in your communications is you have to give people a sense of agency, that they themselves have a way of making a difference. And we experience that a lot with our own employees, where we have invested in training our retail employees how to be better coaches when they go volunteer in the community. But what we learn from working with our employees, I think, can translate into things we can do with consumers. But I think right now there has to be, from a marketing perspective, we always talk about what's your call to action for the consumer, whether it's asking them to donate their time or their money, but how are they going to actually be part of the solution?
And to add to that, in our organization, we use the language of crisis, right? So we talk about this on a daily basis as there being a crisis in youth sports. We've largely viewed it as a crisis in funding, because we do worry about the amount of money that's going out of youth sports, and yet the perception, this disconnect that there is a lot of money that we're seeing through your data is being in higher income families, driving that kind of elite performance of youth sports. And so part of our storytelling, and I think part of the messaging is we've created an entire campaign around sports matter, right? So that is the call to action, to remind a generation and the public that sports matter. It matters for youth development, it matters for character building, it matters for the leadership that will come, because it's more than elite athletes and this quest for the professionalization of sports. It really is about being good citizens of the world. So we talk about it in the sense of crisis, and then we have used some pretty staggering statistics about the number of schools that may not have high schools in particular that may not have high school sports programs. So that's some of the emotional hook, that because it's terrifying if we think about a world without sports or schools without sports. And yet then I think on the other side that the emotional connection that we want to do through our other storytelling is the uplifting power of sports. So we do that through documentaries. We do that through a lot of brand advertising on NBC and some of our others, and our strategic partnerships with Nike. Let's tell this collective story that this does matter, and sports is transcendent and fun. So I think it's a combination of those factors that, depending on your motivation, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're an educator, whether you're a parent, whether you're a kid, if you kind of approach it with a multi-factored campaign, you will be able to find some messaging that resonates.
Got it. You know, in about 15 minutes, we're going to take questions from the crowd, so please start loading them into Slido, and my man Andre here will take a look at them, and you can upvote them, which ones you like, and we'll ask the best ones.
Tom,
at the end.
on continuing on this theme, we've reached a point in society where we've compartmentalized issues financially. We don't want to pay for arts. That's nice and fluffy. And we've forgotten that music has a correlation to math. We've forgotten that visual arts has a correlation to humanities. We've done the same thing with sports. It's just sports. Do we really need PE? Come on. I didn't want to be the kid in the shorts running the mile. I hated that. And we've alienated that or taken it away from the downstream cost. So there is this urgency. I'll give you this to Southeast Michigan statistics. This is from your study. We did a series of surveys. 13% of kids in Southeast Michigan get an hour a day of exercise as recommended by the CDC. The U.S. average is 27%. So if you get 13% to 25%, that's all, just not even all the way to the national average, your downstream healthcare cost with the current cohort of 6 to 18-year-olds is $1.2 billion. And next year we add another grade to that. So that's $1.2 billion in my pocketbook and your pocketbook. This is not about sports. Sports is a means to an end here about making better citizens and making society work better.
Yep.
And I think we have to reinvest in that messaging a bit.
So when you take those statistics into the business community, do you see eyes brighten? Does it seem to unlock potential partnerships?
We've seen reactions, and it's very early in this process, but we've seen eyes widen. The trick now is come back to the other side of storytelling. What do we do about it? What's the implementation strategy? And we've got these partnerships with the community foundations, which are really critical. We're going to fund some staffing inside of them to create roundtables so that the community is brought together, business people are brought together around the 8 place to say, all right, here's the data. What do you want to do about it collectively as a community? And I think that will start this buy-in process. You can't move without an army of the willing, and we have not yet galvanized or created that army.
What's interesting here, I mean, everybody saw the Project Play 2020 announcement earlier today. 2 work groups formed on coaching and sports sampling. They'll figure out exactly what their deliverables are by the fall, hopefully. But let's just sort of take a step back and talk about the potential of with these organizations, highly siloed. You know, I mean, sports is a really interesting space. It's one, you know, this is one of the few countries in the world that does not have a ministry of sports or a department of sports. Or I mean, you deal when you go to these foreign countries, Gary.
Always.
There's no such thing here. There's no entity to kind of coordinate sport development here. Yeah. So, to me, that's one of the great opportunities with Project Play 2020 is these groups are going to get in a room and think about what can we do together. Any ideas? Where do you see the potential of this?
Well, I think that all of us, especially those of us that have commercial interests, certainly us, can clearly see the benefits. I mean, it's almost measurable in greater participation in sports, right? It creates fans. Fans watch more sports. Fans play more. Rob and Freddie would say the same thing. Nike would say the same thing, Dick's, et cetera. But at times there are conflicts, right? We're competitors too. And you wonder to what extent does that undermine the collaboration and the common good, whatever we could achieve if we ever truly, rowed exactly in the same direction. we're all after the same thing. We want kids to play, and we want kids to participate. Beyond, I guess, free play. But free play is the perfect starting point. Does the government bring us all together, under the Ministry of Sport? It's hard to imagine that could happen today.
I'm not proposing that,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah.
I'm just making an observation that explains why we're so
Other
siloed.
fish are frying.
Yeah.
But look, you're starting us here. You're giving us a lot of direction. You and the efforts that are being made with organizations that you have brought together. You've given us a bit of a roadmap. We can all sort of see what it might look like on the other side, because we kind of lived it before. But how do you get us all together, whether it's creating incentives through the contribution of, financial contributions, real estate, stuff, technology. How do we maintain our commercial interests in this industry and serve this sort of common interest of increasing interest in sports and play, which we know at the end of the day will help all of our businesses? I don't have that answer.
Well, how much faith do you have in the idea that at 12 and under, we're not talking about competing for the attention of consumers who are 25 years old or even 18 or 15, but at 12 and under,
Yeah.
the idea that, look, everyone should invest in every kid having access to a quality sport opportunity in America, that if that happens, all boats will be lifted. How valuable do you see that as a, strategic aligner, I guess?
Well, I think that's the appropriate group to focus on. One, I think parents still have a fair amount of influence over 12 and unders, and to the extent that they're the primary conduit between those of us that are fighting for this or otherwise commercially interested in it, and the kids' interest and motivation to participate in sports, you got a fighting chance of accomplishing that at 12 and under. If you focus on 15 to 18, you're going to struggle. And kids have less access to technology. Perhaps that still gives us a fighting chance. I think we're fighting a battle against technology. That seems to be where today's fun is happening versus what we used to do when we went
Do you
out.
think organizations in the sports space recognize that, or do they still see themselves as competitors, right? Is it, are you competing against media companies with each other, leagues with each other, or is really the competition, the screens that are providing entertainment experiences that are desirable to kids?
Generally speaking, no. We're not competing with ESPN. We are the only guys that show the Olympics, and they're the only ones that show Monday Night Football. So, in its sort of simplest form, no. But I think as you drill down, yes. I think teams compete, leagues probably compete, right? Sponsorship, ticket sales, maybe participation, not sure. We're all now talking multi-sport play is critical, so perhaps that isn't a big issue. But I'm not sure we're all completely aligned. Look, in the youth sports participation space, league and team management, there's Jeremy and Brian are in the room where there's tons of competition.
Yeah.
And it's all, a lot of the motivation for it is in the right place. But there is a commercial aspect to it, and market share in that space will ultimately determine, who probably survives. So is that serving the interest of truly of sports participation, even though these are great tools to aid parents and kids to find programs? Yeah.
One of the big trends we're seeing now is youth sports is shifting from one that has been dominated by, mom and pops, almost exclusively local organizations. They're created, they put together a tournament or a team or otherwise, but now we're seeing major national corporate players get involved. Dick's is among them, NBC Sports among them. Nike's already been in the space, obviously, for a while now. Is that good or bad, or to be determined? Corporations, getting in there with their technology, with their business principles, with their needs to make shareholders happy. Make the case for why it's a good thing, Beth.
I do think it's a good thing, and I also think we're willing to. So I think Project Play and then Project Play 2020 is important for all of us who may be competitors because it provides a neutral forum where we can share ideas, and I think we're all coming with a level of openness to say this solving this problem is bigger than any one of us. And so because we can't do it alone, even though we're working in kind of siloed spaces. But if collective impact model has meaning and can't be done alone by definition. And I think the role of Dick's as a corporation, and we are publicly traded, so we have a responsibility to our shareholders as well, is that we're highly accountable for what we're doing as a result of being a large corporation. We're accountable to our customers. We have a high level of visibility. We're accountable to our shareholders. And so I think our learnings from being in the space can be leveraged for the benefit of the smaller organizations with whom we have partnerships. I mean, we have a very large community field operation who have these relationships with all of these small sports leagues, and then we also have a technology platform where we're working with NGBs and state associations, and it's a conversation that we're having, and we're trying to learn from them and to improve both our technology and our giving to meet our customers and to meet the leagues where they are and to understand what their needs are and respond to it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's appropriate that we're in this space, and I think that we can continue to evolve towards collective greatness.
You know, that $15 billion plus industry that is youth sports, it was on the cover of Time and otherwise, is largely, travel-based sports. I mean, so if you can get it into this space and you want to make money, you follow the money, So how do we avoid the scenario where everybody's just trying to cater to the families that have deep pockets when, the family's less than $25,000? There's not much money to be made there, certainly on a per person, per family basis. How do we avoid that scenario? Caitlin, any thoughts?
Yeah, for Nike, people really believe and bleed our mission statement to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world. And if you have a body, you're an athlete. It's not even a question. I think that the employees of Nike, when we talk about how do we show up in this work, lots of people can write a check. What do we bring? We bring the power of our brand, and we bring the power of our employees and their passion. And those are the two things that we think set us apart. And so, the ambition just of the Nike employees to make a difference in the world is pretty powerful. And we as a company have always felt accountable, not just to our shareholders, but to our employees around what we do. And so in that sense, it's an interesting, I understand why you're asking the question, but it's so part of our culture to just show up and do the right thing that it's, in some ways, it's not an issue. On the other hand, what I will sort of say is, we as a community impact team, we run a portfolio approach. We invest in things that are unbranded or have a shared brand like Project Play. And we do things that are a little bit closer to home and maybe smaller, but tell a story that the brand wants to tell, and have a little bit more Nike branding associated with them. But then that's how you leverage the power of the brand to get out there and talk to consumers about what we're doing. So I think there's a role for both sort of the collaborative and sometimes the sort of go it alone, but it all adds up to a bigger picture.
Right. I mean, we're through Sports Engine investing heavily in technology that provides search and discovery of athletic programs, many of which do not have a price. So some of the investment that's going to essentially seize the commercial opportunity is also benefiting participation, access, et cetera. But bringing all of that, ensuring that it's always in the interest of broad access and participation is is something we all have to continue to work on.
Absolutely. One last question, then we're going to turn it over to the crowd. You have some questions lined up in a moment? You good? Okay. So there were a lot of people on stage earlier today. We had to like scrunch people in. I didn't realize we had so many people sign up for the project that the stage wasn't large enough to hold us all, which is terrific. At the same time, as significant as that group is, it's going to take even more organizations to think about how to plug in meaningfully. What types of groups were missing from that, from the Project Play 2020 advisory group announcement today? Who else needs to be brought into this conversation and think about how they're going to plug in?
So, one of the things we've all talked about in using different language, but sort of that relentless focus on the end user. And in this case, it's that kid. How do they actually have a positive experience with play? And most of these national organizations who are on stage today don't necessarily get a chance to get out in the field, see directly for themselves what's going on with the kid and that coach on a regular basis. I think there are a lot of things that we can do nationally, but then there's some things that we have to do closer to home at a city-based level. We always enjoy aligning ourselves with really strong partners to sort of work with community organizations at that city level too. Like there's some great work that we've been doing with Laureus, starting in New York City, about how do you actually create that network of on-the-ground direct service organizations and how they build capacity.
It has to start at the community level. I mean, communities participating in whatever we create is only going to be successful if their voice is heard. So, we're partnering with about 75 organizations on our sports safety program, and we're asking not only the organizations, but the parents and the kids. What do they need? What do they want? What do they understand? So I think it has to be at that community level.
Yeah, I mean, sport is, certainly the theory of Project Play since inception has been, let's build a framework that all stakeholders, that makes a vision that everybody can nod their heads at, a set of strategies that make sense to everyone. Begin talking initially to the folks who control policies and practices and partnerships under the idea that a parent at the bottom, if they're going to demand quality but none of the everything is misaligned, they're not going to find success. So ultimately we do need to get to the parent, and we do need to take it down to the community level and test this stuff out. I mean, is that your perspective, Dave?
I think that you're spot on. I mean, we've used the term ecosystem a number of times. We're not using the word garden system. Gardens are, I know where the lettuce is, and I know where the tomatoes are, and I know where the carrots are. This is a rainforest. And there are going to be all kinds of plants growing in places you've never anticipated, whether they're large groups playing or little groups that are playing at the local level, like downtown boxing gym in Detroit, where 10% of the kids actually box and the rest study. Different plants are going to nourish different people in different ways. So it might be less, Tom, about who else joins on the stage and how the stage gets in community. We're ready in Buffalo, Rochester, and Detroit, by the way. Anytime you're all ready to come play, we'll listen to the ideas. We want to pilot the heck out of it and see what works.
Well, great. We'll be in your post-event survey that you'll receive tonight about 6 p.m. or so. One of the questions is, if and how do you want to plug into Project Play 2020? We haven't defined the ask of organizations yet, but we just initially want to get a sense of, from all of your organizations, do you find it interesting? Please share your thoughts with us, and we will follow up in due time. We'd like to go to some questions. What we got, Andre?
So our first question is, do large health insurance companies actually want to see the proliferation of quality and consistent sport programs as a means to cut future healthcare costs?
That's interesting.
Ooh.
There you go.
There's an incentive.
There's an incentive. Yeah.
Lower premiums.
Yeah, I think again, it's going to go back to if you can demonstrate that if you teach a child how to play a sport and prevent an injury, as opposed to going and playing a sport and then needing surgery and all the medical costs, you would think there would be an incentive there to really, incentivize people to actually get out and be healthy and not have to incur those costs, those medical costs. So it is one of the things we're looking at with our program at the hospital. How can we develop that incentive for insurance companies? But we have to have that data. We have to be able to show that keeping kids healthy in the long run is going to save medical costs.
You have a thought, Gary?
No, I just, if one could get a lower insurance premium if they were more active, if there was a test,
Yeah,
physical literacy, your words,
yeah,
there's an incentive. That's
yeah.
all.
I mean, it already exists, right? Sometimes you get X number of dollars for signing for a gym membership, or if your BMI is of a certain level or otherwise.
Yep.
Insurance companies, employers too, right? I mean, could they create incentives?
Yeah, well, some of the insurance companies are doing that now. You know, you can, if you don't smoke, if you demonstrate you go to clubs, you get a credit on your insurance. So it exists, I think, on a very modest level right now.
Yeah, I actually think there's one insurance company, I shall go name because I haven't confirmed it, but I think they actually give their employees a certain amount of money each year if they volunteer to coach a sports team, which is an interesting idea, easily introduced. What else we have?
Our next question is, are metrics getting in the way of grant makers supporting good work happening at the grassroots level?
Yes. Yes. Sometimes we're tracking metrics that are going to take a generation to affect, and grant makers are incredibly fickle. That's why we fund in 3-year cycles. If we only fund it for 3 years and we don't want to continue, we can go to the next thing, right? The next shiny object. So we should be looking at trend data. We should be looking at immediate impact. We should be looking at storytelling. But the big metrics are going to take too long to move, and sometimes we're waiting to understand those metrics for way too long before we're grant making.
What else, Andre?
How does a small community-based organization get to partner with large global organizations?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I think that that's something where, at least at Nike, we really sort of we've tiered our portfolio. So we have programs that we work directly with where we're sort of, it's kind of, sometimes you're getting married to us and we're all in, and either you like that or you don't. But with sort of strategic partners, we are really coming in and having a point of view around what's the innovation we're trying to drive with that partner. We might come in and sort of say, hey, your branding needs help. I mean, we bring a full sort of arsenal of assets to those partnerships. But there's so many great organizations out in the field, and we simply cannot do that with all of them. And so we also have grant making mechanisms, whether it is something called the Nike Community Impact Fund, where we do small grant making around our community retail doors, or it's coming out of some of our cause marketing funds. So the N7 collection funds grassroots programs that drive physical activity for Native American youth. That's a sort of hey, we want to build the field. We don't have the same level of partnership and expectations, but we want to kind of start to create opportunities for more organizations to grow and develop. So even with a global company, we just actually redid our Global Community Impact website, so it's a lot easier to figure out how you do plug in, because I know that for a while it was a mystery, but hopefully now you can see literally what are the grant application opportunities versus where we strategically partner.
Is CSR the only way to hold corporations accountable to the communities that they operate in, or is following the missions leading to the rise in unhealthiness?
Can you say that again?
Sorry. Is CSR the only way to hold corporations accountable to the communities that they operate in, or is following the missions leading to the rise in people being unhealthy?
Dave, you're nodding your head, so I think you got your mind around this.
Yeah, I have my mind around this because philanthropy tends to ignore market. And I think the mandated efforts to force corporate strategy out ignores market. And the reality is all the corporate folks up here understand the market. And if we don't increase youth participation, they're all going to suffer. So there's a self-interest mode here beyond legislation or beyond a legal element that's got to be considered. And we've got to, frankly, us in the community, we have to do a better job of helping the corporations clarify their self-interest in playing in this space. I think you all have certainly demonstrated you're doing that already. There are other corporations we've got to do a better job with. But ultimately, the market will be far more effective than mandating a community return strategy.
Is the healthcare sector doing enough here? I mean, it's huge. It always drives me crazy. We talk about healthcare in this country. What are we going to do with healthcare? Nobody ever talks about physical activity, sport activity, actually like getting and keeping people healthy in the first place. It's all about dealing with sick people, which is, of course, you need to do. But why hasn't that conversation shifted?
I think that
more?
conversation was starting. Look at your panel last year and talking about getting active and tying that to obesity and diabetes. But it's I don't think it's a top priority as it should be. It's something that, in certain specialty hospitals like ours, yes, it's a focus because we understand that if you're obese, you're going to have joint problems. But I think as a national forum, it doesn't get that attention. We started down that path, and hopefully we will regain that momentum again. But I think that conversation has to happen.
Earlier today, Don Wright from HHS and acting executive director of the President's Council said a few things. Number one, that childhood obesity will continue to be a priority of this administration. Number two, that physical activity matters. Number three, that sport participation is particularly an area they see of opportunity. So what would your, and I apologize, we didn't prep for this at all in the green room, but it occurred to me now, it's a good question to ask. What would be the ask? What would you like to see backed up but from the federal government? What type of action to support those stated priorities? Anyone want to take that?
What pops to my mind is what you said as an example before, which is we don't have a health minister. If we were like other countries where you had somebody that was overseeing under one rubric all the organizations working together, you'd be having the dialogue. It would not be perfect, but you have a place where that exists and lives, and we don't have that. Everything is very siloed. So that's what pops to my mind, having a centralized group that's looking at not just obesity, but the relationship to obesity to inactivity, diabetes, inactive sports, all those things, and putting those things together and coming up with those type of solutions to the problems. But we don't have that. So that's what comes into my mind.
For me, I'm not sure how much of it happens at the federal level. A little bit to the point that Dave made around sort of the time horizon to realize benefits. We're pretty good about talking about the billions of dollars things cost. We're having a harder time disaggregating the numbers around this investor makes this investment and gets this payout. And so I actually think it's sort of more at a local level. There's different math that we need to do in order to get people to sort of recognize the cost-benefit analysis.
Terrific. Any final question? Andre? You're all good. Okay, well listen, I wanted to thank everyone on this panel. It was really terrific comments. Great insights. All right, thank you folks.